He had tried so hard to outrun his past, to build a new life, but no matter how far he ran, the shadows always caught up. Back in the present, Arthur gasped, the memory fading as quickly as it had come. The kitchen swam back into focus, with more shadowy figures lining up, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. The whispers had grown louder, a chorus of accusing voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "No," Arthur whimpered, squeezing his eyes shut. "Please, leave me alone." But when he opened his eyes, the figures were still there, and they were moving closer, their featureless faces somehow radiating an unmistakable aura of judgment and retribution. Arthur's breath came in ragged gasps as his dread grew, threatening to consume him entirely. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift, and suddenly Arthur felt himself being pulled into another memory, one from long ago. The dingy kitchen faded away, replaced by a small, shabby room in post-war Munich. Arthur found himself staring at his reflection in a grimy mirror. At 25, he should have been in the prime of his life. Instead, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once proud posture was hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. It had been 3 years since the war ended. Arthur Kessler, a bland name, one with the ability to fade into the background. He touched the scar on his chin, a reminder of the accident that had conveniently altered his appearance just enough to avoid recognition. A knock at the door made him jump. "Herr Kessler, your rent is due." "Ja, Frau Miller. I'll have it tomorrow, I promise," Arthur called back, wincing at how easily the lie came to his lips. He'd lost another job last week, his third in as many months. It wasn't the work itself. Arthur had always been diligent, efficient, but the nightmares left him exhausted, prone to mistakes. And then there were the moments when a sound, a smell, would transport him back. Arthur shook his head, trying to dispel the memories. He had to focus on the present, on survival. Crossing the small room, he pulled a battered suitcase from under the bed. Inside, wrapped in a faded shirt, was a small bundle of cash, the last of his savings. As he counted out the rent money, a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. Arthur's heart raced as he recognized it, the letter from his mother sent just before everything changed. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, though he knew every word by heart. "My dearest Arthur," it began, "we are so proud of you, serving your country. But these rumors we hear, they cannot be true. But we know that you are a good son and a good man." Arthur crumpled the letter, a sob catching in his throat. He stood abruptly, needing to escape the suffocating confines of his room. Outside, the streets of Munich were busy with people rebuilding their lives, trying to forget the horrors of the past few years. Arthur envied them, their ability to move forward. As he walked, he found himself in a familiar part of town. Without conscious thought, his feet had carried him to a local Jewish temple, or what remained of it. The once grand building was now a burnt-out shell, a stark reminder of Kristallnacht and all that followed. Arthur stood before it, memories washing over him. He remembered standing in this very spot years ago, watching as the flames consumed the building. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I'm so sorry." A hand on his shoulder made him flinch. Arthur turned to see an elderly man, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "It is a terrible thing, Ja," the man said, gesturing to the ruined synagogue. "So much lost." Arthur nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "But we must rebuild," the man continued, "not just buildings, but lives, hearts, It is the only way forward." As the man walked away, Arthur stood rooted to the spot, his words echoing in his mind. Rebuild. Could he rebuild himself? Could he ever atone for what he had done? Arthur stumbled back, his vision blurring with tears. He turned and ran, desperate to escape the ghosts of his past. But with every step, he knew the truth. There was no escaping what he had done. The guilt would follow him forever. The memory faded, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. But the weight of that guilt remained. Arthur found himself back in his kitchen, sprawled on the cold tile floor. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of his vision now seemed to coalesce, taking on more distinct forms. "Please," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I know that now. If I could take it all back." But the figures only drew closer, their silent judgment more damning than any words could ever be. Arthur felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, threatening to crush what was left of his spirit. As the spectral forms loomed over him, Arthur's mind was thrust back to the source of his deepest shame, a memory he had tried desperately to bury. A young and strong Arthur, in his crisp SS uniform, stood at attention, overseeing a work detail in the sweltering heat. His eyes swept across the ragged line of prisoners, their emaciated forms bent under the weight of their labor. Suddenly, he noticed an elderly man stumble and fall, his frail body crumpling to the dusty ground. It was clear the man lacked the strength to rise again. For a fleeting moment, Arthur's gaze locked with the fallen prisoners. Those watery eyes were filled with a potent mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a silent, desperate plea for mercy. "Get up, you lazy old fool. Please, I just need a moment." The old man's voice quivered and winced in pain as he held his hip. Casually, Arthur pulled out his Luger. He squared his shoulders, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "If you can't work, you are worthless to me. Please, please, I can work." The man's voice filled with pain as he struggled to stand, but couldn't. "Please just give me a moment." With almost a bored look on his face, Arthur leveled his pistol at the man. "Don't worry, you don't have to get up." The work detail stopped their labor and began to look on in horror. The growing silence and dread sent an ache through everyone's bones. Then a shot rang out. The only sound that followed was leaves rustling in the wind. Then Keller's voice, a terrible harbinger of death. "Get back to work." As he strode away, boots crunching on the gravel, Arthur forced himself not to dwell on what would inevitably happen to those who couldn't keep up with the grueling pace. He had his duties, after all, and sentiment had no place in the machine of which he was now an integral part. The memory faded, leaving Arthur feeling hollow and cold. The years that followed seemed to blur together, a desperate attempt to outrun the horrors he had perpetrated. But no matter how far he ran, or how much time passed, the weight of his actions remained. Years later, Arthur Kessler sat alone in his modest living room, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. The man who had once wielded life and death with cold indifference now spent his days in quiet solitude, haunted by the ghosts of his actions. He had tried to build a new life, to find redemption in the love of his family, but the shadows of his past were never far behind. The doorbell rang, startling Arthur from his thoughts. He shuffled to the door, heart racing with both hope and dread. Lisa stood on the porch, Suzanne beside her. It was the first time they had visited in years. "Come in, please," Arthur said, his voice wavering. "I'm so glad you came." The living room was tense, with unspoken words. Lisa's eyes darted around, unable to settle on her father. Suzanne, now in her mid-20s, looked uncomfortable but determined. "I've been trying to reach out," Arthur began, "to explain, to apologize." "Apologize?" Lisa's voice was sharp. "Do you think that's enough? That you can just say sorry and erase what you did?" Arthur flinched at her words. "No, of course not. I know I can never truly atone, but I'm trying to do some good, to make up for it." Lisa stood abruptly. "You can't make up for genocide, Dad. You can't bring back the people you killed." Suzanne placed a hand on her mother's arm. "Mom, please." We agreed to hear him out. Arthur looked at his granddaughter, seeing a glimmer of the little girl who once adored him. "Suzanne, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm not that man anymore. I've changed." "Have you?" Lisa asked, her voice softer now, tinged with sadness. "Or have you just gotten better at hiding who you really are?" The question hung in the air, heavy with decades of pain and mistrust. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. Suzanne broke the silence. "Opa, I want to believe you've changed, but it's hard. What you did, it's unforgivable." "I know," Arthur whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "But I have to try. To be better, to do better. It's all I have left." As Lisa and Suzanne prepared to leave, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. They had come, they had listened. It wasn't forgiveness, but perhaps it was a start. "We'll think about what you've said," Lisa said at the door, her voice carefully neutral. "But don't expect miracles, Dad. Some wounds never heal." As the door closed behind them, Arthur sank into his chair, a mixture of exhaustion and faint hope washing over him. He had faced his family, had taken the first tentative step towards reconciliation. It wasn't much, but it was something. He clung to that small spark of possibility, unaware that it would be the last time he'd ever see them. In the weeks and months that followed, Arthur waited anxiously for a call, a visit, any sign that the fragile bridge he'd tried to build would hold. But as time stretched on, that hope began to fade. Calls went unanswered, letters unopened. The silence grew deafening. Years passed, and Arthur's world gradually shrank. The promise of reconnection withered, leaving behind only the bitter taste of missed opportunities and unspoken words. His days blurred together in a haze of regret and loneliness, the memory of that final meeting both a comfort and a torment. In the end, it hadn't been enough. The weight of his past had proven too heavy, the chasm too wide to cross. Arthur was left alone with his thoughts, his guilt, and the ghosts of what might have been. Now Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps as he lay on the cold kitchen floor. The chill of the tiles seemed to seep into his very bones, a physical manifestation of the cold loneliness that had become his life. As he struggled to move, to call for help, the shadows at the edges of his vision began to shift and deepen. Arthur's eyes widened in horror. The shadowy figures began to materialize, their forms initially vague and indistinct. Gradually, they took shape. Emaciated bodies, hollow eyes, faces etched with suffering. Men, women, children, all victims of the atrocities he had participated in decades ago. They stood in a silent circle around him, their eyes filled with an unspeakable sorrow and accusation. Arthur recognized some of them, faces that had haunted his nightmares for years. "I'm sorry," Arthur sobbed, his words seeming pathetically inadequate in the face of their silent judgment. "I've tried to change, to make amends. Please." But the figures remained unmoved, their silent presence more damning than any words could be. As Arthur lay there, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him entirely. Suddenly, the lead figure, the man from the work detail, began to change. Its form shifted, growing taller, more imposing. With mounting dread, Arthur watched as it transformed into a shadowy version of himself. Young, strong, wearing the dreaded SS uniform. This specter of his past self stared down at him, eyes cold and unforgiving. "No," Arthur whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, I'm not that man anymore. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But the figures remained silent, their accusing eyes never wavering. The shadowy SS version of Arthur loomed over him, its cold, merciless eyes reflecting all the cruelty and indifference he had once embodied. With deliberate slowness, the spectre reached into its holster and withdrew a Luger pistol. Arthur's eyes widened in recognition. It was the same weapon he had carried all those years ago. "I'm ready," Arthur whispered, closing his eyes. "Do what you must." The last thing Arthur heard was the ominous click of the Luger's hammer being cocked. Then, everything went black. Arthur Kessler's lifeless body lay on the cold kitchen floor, his unseeing eyes fixed on the ceiling. The shadows that had haunted him in his final moments had dissipated, leaving behind only the stark reality of his lonely death. As we observe this scene, we are left to ponder the complexities of human nature and the weight of our actions. Arthur Kessler, once an SS officer, spent decades grappling with the atrocities he committed. He sought redemption, tried to change, and longed for forgiveness. But was it enough? Can a lifetime of regret and attempts at atonement balance the scales against unspeakable crimes? Are there sins so grievous that they remain beyond the reach of forgiveness, no matter how sincere the remorse? What is the nature of true repentance? Is it found in the words we speak, the actions we take, or the changes we make within ourselves? And who has the right to grant absolution for crimes against humanity? Perhaps the most difficult question of all is this: in a world scarred by hatred and violence, how do we break the cycle? Can we learn from the darkest chapters of history, or are we doomed to repeat them? As Arthur Kessler's story comes to its lonely end, we are left to wrestle with these questions. His life and death serve as a stark reminder of the long shadow cast by our choices and the enduring power of our past actions. In the end, is forgiveness a gift we grant to others, or a grace we hope to receive ourselves? And in the face of unforgivable acts, can we find a way to move forward without forgetting, to heal without absolving?